here this evening with the Wyoming hotshot crew at the scene of the Brewer fire shelter deployment. It's 8 o'clock in the evening, within an hour and a half so of the time that the incident occurred 2 days ago. I call your attention to the obvious intensity of the burn as you look at the crowns and the trees down here on the left. And as we pan slowly up through the meadow, you can see how the fire ran through the meadow, ran towards the top, and as you get to the top, you can see the scene where the crew finally deployed their fire shelter and made their stand. With us tonight this evening is Neil Beisler of the hotshot crew. He was in charge of the folks that were in here that evening, and I'll turn this over to Neil and let him describe what actually happened. Let's go ahead and cut, and I'll put this mic on you.
Okay. Speed. Go ahead, Neil.
I'm standing in the middle where the Wyoming hotshots deployed their fire shelters night before last. I'll try to explain what happened. Basically, we took our fire from back here. We showed you that a second ago and showed you the crown fire that came at us. I'll try to set up the situation of what was going on. We were digging line to the east. The fire was fairly mellow, and a helicopter came over and spotted this meadow and figured it would be better for us to bring our line in, tie it in here, and pick up a dozer and take off from here. It's a good thing he did, because within 10 minutes of that, we were running in here as the only area where we could survive what was coming at us. There's a person out there at the edge of the timber, if you can see him. That's where I came out of the timber. I took one last look to see what the fire was doing, and the time I broke out of the timber there, the crew had come to the center of the meadow to prepare a safe area. At this point, we had not decided to deploy fire shelter. As the fire built in intensity, we had some weather changes. The air got very calm, it got warmer. The air felt like it compressed on us, and the fire intensity grew. We had a crown fire down canyon below us, about a half a mile. At this point, it wasn't doing us any harm. The crew here was preparing a safe area at that time. The other squad boss and myself were in communications and felt that we could weather this fire that was coming in the center of the meadow. About that time, both crown fires lifted up and increased their intensity, and the entire distance between the two crown fires lifted up into the tops. At this point, Rick decided to bring the crew up on the road and deploy fire shelters. The reason he brought the crew on the road was at this time we decided we could not prepare this area properly for a shelter deployment. As you're looking down through this area, you can see caches of equipment that were thrown away in an effort to get them away from our deployment area. We have a tool up there on the upper left and some fusees. The tool was not very much damaged, and the fusees did not ignite. Moving over a little bit to the right, we have a large cache of oil and gasoline that also did not ignite. They're in cig bottles. There's probably a dozen or so of them there. Now, these were thrown there by the Sawyers when this area was abandoned. Further up, we have the chainsaw, and it was damaged slightly, but it still runs. Back up on the hill, more fuel bottles in a totally black area. Again, did not explode. Lower down, probably 15 fusees. Not a one of them lit off. Scattered throughout the field is a semicircle of fusees that were thrown at last ditch to try to start a backfire, hopefully to take some of the fuel away from in front of us. All those burned, but yet you can still see the ash tracks on them. There was no damage in those areas either. point of abandoning the lower area, moving up to the road, the crew seriously began to deploy fire shelters. At this point, we knew we were not going to survive standing up in the meadow. We feel that that was a better area because there was more mineral soil showing. It turns out to be a good move because the majority of the heat we took came from all the way across the meadow, 75 to 100 yards away.
Here we are in the original area that the crew at first decided to try their deployment. As we approach it, you can see that this choice was not really a bad one, other than the difficulty in trying to prepare the shelter sites by actually cutting the brush. Portions of the area did not burn. Parts of the equipment, even fusees that were left in this particular area, did not ignite. The chainsaw that was left and abandoned here is still serviceable. So even had the crew elected to stay in this location, it looked like this was a pretty good site selection initially for their first stand.
Didn't you pitch some really far down there? You were launching fuel bottles like crazy.
Yeah, originally they're over there by that fusees, and I flew about this way.
I've fallen down too many times trying to do this. Okay. We've now moved our camera from the location down in the meadow that gave us a panoramic view of the meadow and the final stand where the Wyoming Hotshot crew deployed their fire shelters. Standing here on the road where the actual deployment took place, with me is Neil Beisler, who's going to explain to us from this vantage point, you can't see it again, what occurred, what way the shelters were deployed, where the fire came from, and those kinds of things. So Neil, if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay, basically, the crew moved up from the lower area, the lower deployment area, into this one. The crew deployed along the road in a narrow fashion. Most of the shelters were lined up. At that point, while everybody was in their shelters, the first of the fire hit our area. Okay, the first fire I saw that actually came from the top of those trees and actually came into our tent area. This was when the crown fire first hit the edge of the meadow. Distance. You're talking probably 75 to 100 yards. And we actually had the flame from those trees touch our tent. At that time, we got a high wind, and we got our first blast of the smoke. That passed fairly quickly. I lost the edge of my shelter then. Unfortunately, I got a look at what was coming the second time. That was a lower fire. That was the maroon-colored, purple-colored fire that was down on the ground. It actually came right at us in round balls, a solid front across there, moving along the ground. This is what gave myself more heat than the first one. As you can see over here, as we deployed in this line, the people on this side and the front probably took more heat, and possibly the folks in the back might have gotten more of the smoke. This remains to be seen after some of the shelters are taken apart and looked at. But it seemed, as from my point in the front, that I did not have that much smoke. I had a lot of heat, and there was fire around, but I didn't take all that much smoke. You can also see, by looking down the road, some of the patterns where some of the fire shelters were. You also see some piles of gear. This was line gear and tools that were left outside the shelters. Most of them were totally or at least half destroyed by fire, were still burning after the people came out of their shelters. I think it's important that it be noted that this nylon was burning vigorously at the time when we first came out of the shelters. When people first got up, there was still a strong wind blowing. We secured the fire shelters and began to administer first aid. At this time, we did a count, found out we had everybody, reestablished communications with our division supervisor, and called for help.
Good. Hold a second. Wait. Start talking before you get there.
Okay. Here's a set of line gear that was almost totally destroyed. This was thrown here when Rick and I were getting people out of their fire shelters. This one was burning vigorously and was stuck to the side of someone's fire shelter. Over here's the seat out of the van. It was thrown there during the evacuation of the injured person. Of course, that wasn't there during the fire. There's a pretty good gathering of tools and water bottles. It did get pretty hot over on this side. There's just pieces. There's nothing left. It got hot on this side. There was a tent right here. You can see the outline from it. So we did have intensity right next to the tents.
I'm doing it.
Here we are we've moved up to where the fire shelters were deployed and had the crews place the shelters back up in the positions, as we can tell from the marks and burn marks on the ground, where they were originally laid out when the fire swept over this area. As you can see, the broad or the flank of the deployment was faced toward the fire, which was coming up from directly in front of us, directly down across the front of the road. At this time, we'd like to move down past each one of the shelters and have each one of the individuals lift up a shoulder, show us the area where he was placed. I'd like you to pay particular attention to the burn marks.
Okay.
As we go down this line of fire shelters and closely examine the location of each shelter deployment, I'd like you to pay attention to the burn marks around the shelter and also to any burn marks or obvious signs of heat that we have on the shelters themselves. The first person that we're going to talk to here tonight is Sam Good. And I was right here, and you can see right where my feet were, and it did get a little hot in there, as you can see by the shelter here. I threw my pack and the saw right in there. And Kevin Kulo was right there, and we kept really good contact with each other, because we were so close. We kept good contact. He laid right in that track right there. Okay, now moving down the line and uphill just to the other side of the road.
My name's Gordon McWilliams, and I was laying right in through here. You can see the outline of the shoulder here around the fire. And a little fire did creep in on my right side and happened to burn my elbow a little bit. You can't really see the bandage because I've got my shirt down.
You were burned on that elbow there where that fire came in.
Yes, I was. I didn't realize it until after I got back. But I was burned. My shoulder was a little scorched, even where the fire came in right there. Piece of the black on that. And it was pretty hot. Other than that. And then the guy being blind moved here right now, laying right beside me here. And you can't really see the outline quite as well there. You can see just a little bit where fire went out and down. And we talked throughout the fire too. Kept each other reassured. Based with my shelter net, and as you can see, you've got some burns at the end part of it where the fire was coming upward, and As you can see, the shelters do work. It's still in good shape yet.
Were you burned by the fire that had to scorch your shelter?
Well, when I got out, my line gear was all on fire. So, the fire was pushing against the shelter.
You seem to have a little more fire or singe marks underneath your shelter than the others. Did you have a problem with that?
Yes, I did. See, earlier, like what I said earlier was when the heat was coming in and the smoke, I had to fingers and my toes raise my body up. But at the same time, keep the shelter from falling out.
That was because the fire was under you that you raised up, you think?
And your normal position on the crew is foreman, the assistant crew boss. The assistant crew boss? Yeah. Well, we're going to have to call, but I guess probably a foreman now. Acting crew boss during this incident. Yeah, you were the acting crew boss. Go ahead and run us through a little narrative if you would.
Okay,
started out as a normal shift. It looked pretty easy. We had backup from a strike team of BIA crews. We didn't know what we had, really, so we went out scouting, and Mark found a slop over. So bring the crew in, and we'll start building line, flanking direct line. What was your assignment with direct line that night? Well, it was after we found the slop over. Probably not initially. Initially, it was run the cat line and burn out and hold and patrol. But I don't think that spot fire or slop over was in the plans. In other words, it started between plans, and when we went out on the line, been going all day and missed air patrol missed or whatever. But anyway, just right off the bat, we had this slop over, and so we decided. At that time, we had a cat. We were going to go as direct as possible with the cat and burn out what he missed, fingers. And we went about 200-300 yards. With the hotshot crew in the front, knocking trees out of the way if they were a hazard, the cat punching line, and the BIA strike team behind us patrolling and holding the line. And it was, standard operation, working real well. The cat operator got scared at some point, and the game decided he wanted out. He didn't like this. He didn't like the terrain. He was going to have to go down a 50-foot hill or so that was fairly gradual, no problem for a cat. I think he was new at the fire game and he got scared, so he left. You know where he was from? No, I don't. He had a D8 cat, 10-foot blade on it, rippers on the back, with a set of grousers on it. She was able to rip through that country real nice. We had one the night before. You couldn't tell whether or not it was just a farmer that they had picked out or anything. He was just there.
That was a dozer tied to Miller Construction, so it was a commercial dozer, but I don't know about the operator.
When I talked to him, I stopped him. We had one of our other squad bosses acting as tractor boss that night, and Rick called me on the radio and said my dozer just turned around and left. So I flagged him down, and he opened the door, and he was just his arm was shaking, and his voice was quivering. I says, I don't want any of this. It's my contract. I don't have to go in the fire, and I'm not going. I said, fine, that's your option. And just be careful on the way out. Don't let anybody else, because he was freaking out. So he was a road construction or something like that. Not used to dealing with it. Sounds like maybe anyway. Yeah, kind of construction guys. Yeah, we weren't going to ask him to do anything that the guy doesn't want to do. We've worked with him before. Cat operators. Most of them like to prove that they can do anything. And this guy, he just didn't want to be there. So we said, see you later. And changed our plan to go direct hand line now. Informed the BIA strike team that we were going to start punching hand line in. And they would have to take over the entire holding action behind us because we would need our entire crew to big line. So this was a creeping ground fire, backing into a slight wind, uphill wind. Probably a foot or two away from the flames with our line. No problem. It's hot. But the sun's going down, we're getting some shadows. And pretty standard operation so far. What aspect were you on? Let's see. Was it warm or cool in the afternoon? There was one that would be warm in the afternoon.
Warming in the afternoon and evening.
It was a pretty hot day in Owens, but it had started to break. The temperature had started to come down. Not very much, but you could tell that the shadows were coming in. The heat was going out of the day a little bit anyway, finally. So we were going as direct as possible, and the guys were hot and sweating. It was, we were a direct line, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. But it was working real well. As soon as it would burn up to our line, it was ponderosa, pine needles, real easy line construction, not too bad a song. We were moving a pretty good clip. Our other squad boss was burning out any fingers in between, and at the most our burnouts were taking maybe 20 foot when we were going that close to the end. So it was working real well. We had, at that time, I tied in with Mark, who had scouted ahead. He said up to about 3/4 of a mile, and it was still the same operation. He didn't know how long. According to the helicopter, it was a long, long ways around. At that point, the helicopter spotted us at that meadow. And Mark went out scouting to look for it, and we both found it. And we decided to route our line into it, bring that dozer around if we could get one, take off down that road, try to use it as a line, because at that time we felt we'd never get around it, never hooked it. Mark took off to work with the dozer. Just one question. So your plan then was go line into the meadow, through the meadow, tie to the road, and then use the road as far as you could. Right. Try to make a little more time and square it off and use as much opening as possible. At this time, they had the contractor who owned the dozer. Mark talking on the radio, and Mark said, "I'll come up and talk to you personally. Let's try to get this resolved, get the dozer back operating again. I believe to get them back into the meadow and take off on our new plan now." So he took off for finding him, and I went back to the crew and told them that we were going to take a left-hand turn there, kind of basically, and head west. The crew had moved a little bit away from the fire at that point, but it was getting hotter. Rick said I had to pull the saws about 50 feet away from the line then because of the heat. So I said, okay, let's be careful. It's still a ground fire. Still a ground fire. I went back and reflagged into the meadow. I turned around, and about that time, a bunch of trees got up in the crown. A bunch of fire got up in the crown of some trees. The sawyers were right there, and they said they stopped sawing for a second. And I called Rick, and I said, how's it doing? He said, well, it's up in the crown, but it'll probably come back down. Now, Rick is one of the persons with the saw. With the saw. He earlier was with the dozer. He's normally our saw boss. So I said, okay, keep an eye on it, and it did go down. So we turned to the west. Now we're cutting basically in direct line. The fire is coming down, but we're between 50 and 150 feet away from it at times. I went out to scout because I heard something from the northwest, a firehead that Mark and I had talked about earlier, building again. At that time, the wind was blowing it away from us, blowing that fire basically to the northeast. We didn't feel that was going to be a problem for us if the wind stayed constant. I went down to look at that. As I got closer to it, it got dead calm. No wind whatsoever. And the temperature seemed to go up, and the humidity seemed to drop. I don't know what brought that on. Rick mentioned something about a weather cell. At that point, I got a weird feeling. And I said, shut the saws down. Let's get the crew out of here. I don't really know why we decided instantly to do that, but we did. And at that time, the fire hadn't done anything yet, but there was no wind. It was dead calm, and the heat was oppressive. It was like somebody closed us in. It felt like the temperature went up 15 degrees instantly. At that point, the wind came over the top, directly at us, and this time the crew was already on its way out. Just didn't like the feel of things, so we were pulling them out. The end squad boss told us that the crew was moving and clear, and he wasn't, at that time, able to get to us. He went back up the line the other way. He was, let's see, he was
You knew he was going to do that?
Yes, we did. He was in radio communication. He was quite a bit behind our crew. He was working with the strike team holding team to inform them as to what we were doing. So there was a kind of a gap between the end of our crew and his. And he got word to go the other way. Or he decided it would be better, and it's probably good. He probably wouldn't have made it across trying to catch up to the end guys on us. So our crew made it. I met him 150 yards from the meadow. I said, down a draw, up the draw, straight out in the middle of the meadow, sit with Rick till I find out what's going on. At this time, the wind hooked and brought embers. The embers had been going over. Now they just came down all around. And we're starting numerous spot fires. Too many to stop. Didn't meadow. Well, this was just on the edge of the timber. I was still in the timber at this time. Rick got everybody in the meadow. He counted. Everybody was accounted for. At that time, Mark called me on the radio and asked me if the fire had gotten across this draw. This draw ran north-south. It was real steep and not very deep. And he didn't know if it had gotten across that. It was about 100 yards in the timber from the meadow. I walked back in to see if it had crossed the draw. And as I walked in there, crown fire on one end and the crown fire on the lower end down the hill, the one that was to the northeast that we didn't think would bother us, got up in the trees really big. And the entire line between the two of them lifted up instantly into the treetops. I've never seen it done before. Been on like 200 project fires, and I've never seen a line lift. There was no ladder fuel. There's no, it didn't climb up the tree trunks. The entire area lifted from a backing ground fire to a crown fire in a matter of 10 seconds. At this point, it started creating a draft. They turned around. Rick said, "Get out of there, it's blowing up." I was starting to jog out into the meadow. At that time, I saw the fire shelters being deployed. I looked, I thought maybe I wouldn't make it to them. At this point, they found a better spot to deploy, moved farther away from the fire by 75 yards on a road. There was much less ground fuel there.
They were on a road?
They were on a meadow. In the meadow. Okay, initially we picked dead center of the meadow, figuring we didn't know what was going to happen. We had spot fires all around us. Didn't realize the head was going to come at us the way it did. So, we got everybody to the road. I was still in the meadow coming up. I still hadn't reached the crew. About half of them had their shelters out and were unfolding them. Rick was in his, tucking it under. And everybody else was in various stages of getting in. I finally reached the crew, and the crown hit the edge of the meadow. By this time, everybody was in, but one of the fellas was having trouble. He was panicky, couldn't get his shelter to unroll. I got him in his tent. By this time, the fire was in the meadow. I opened my shelter. I had my line gear on. I got it over me, and I hit the ground, and I wasn't all the way in my shelter when the fire hit. I had fire come in mine. It seemed like we got a tongue at first of fire that came directly from the timber. I saw that come off the edge of the timber, come straight for us, and I ducked. That went over. I looked again, because my shelter wasn't down, and then I saw the rolling ground fire coming out through the grass. Well, this was off above the grass. So this was about 2 feet off the ground. It was purplish, maroon colored. At this point, I took one look around. Everybody was in. Couldn't count. I only had a second. I went back down again. I had a hole in either end of my tent, and I was working on those when it hit us. And I again took fire inside my tent. I didn't have sleeves down or gloves on. At that time, still hadn't had a chance to prepare myself. I got my tent sealed up, got my fires out. I had canteens in there, which probably saved me. put them out with the canteens, and I used the canteens to hold the tent down because then the wind came.
Because you didn't have to do it.
Right. So I held my tent down. At that time, Rick and I were talking to each other on the radio.
So you could communicate down there.
Okay. And he was able to give me a better narrative of what was going on because I was busy self-preservation. I wanted to get my tent a little more situated. I did finally get my edges rolled under, and I got my legs spread out, and I wanted to make sure my feet were hooked in my straps because I knew that I was going to have things to do, and I didn't want to worry about behind me. The fire hit us. I talked to Rick. He said, I got heat on the front. I said, I got heat on the left side. So we knew which way the fire was coming. I said, okay, I got heat on my right side, Rick. And he said, okay, it just moved over to my right, but I'm losing my head heat. I don't have it in front of me. It's on top of me now. At this point, I moved, and the tip of my shelter came up again, and there was fire between Rick's tent and mine. And I slammed it back down again. And then the heat was on top of us. Okay. We were talking a little bit between us. On the radio? On the radio. At this time, Rick started to talk. We didn't know if we could transmit out. His radio's a little weaker than mine. And it was kind of just like in the fire shelter movie. He described what was happening. He said, I have heat on my face. I have heat on my right side. I'm taking smoke. Temperature's going up. And I knew what he was doing and what I was doing, and we could tell what was happening outside. At this time, we felt fairly confident that everything was going to be all right. At this time, the fire hit us, and we really hadn't been hit. And we got hit with high winds, terrible loud noise. The fire shelters were tried to be torn out of your hands. We tried to lift up. At this time, one of the people in the shelters behind me, the shelter was touching mine, screamed, and either the wind moved, her tent, or she moved. This time I thought we had somebody stand up and run, and tried to, by yelling, tried to find out if anybody was around. There was too much noise, and there was no communication possible. At that time, just Rick and I were able to talk. I tried to call Mark at this time. I tried to tell him we had just gone under the flames and got some water on my radio, and I don't know exactly what transmission went out. After that, my radio quit working until we got out of the tents. I don't know whether that was from the fire being on or whatever. I think I was only in my tent about 3 minutes before I put my head out. Rick and I talked to each other, and he said, I'm going to stick my head out the left side. And so I stuck my head out the right side. And we did that. We pulled back in. We looked at each other and pulled back in. I said, it's too hot. Let's wait another second. We waited another minute. I got up and I said, let's you and I at least see if we can stand it out here.
You were talking to him just
on the radios at this time.
On the radio?
Right. It was still, you couldn't see. I kind of could see him. He was only as far away from me to you.
Yeah.
But the smoke was intense. The heat was fairly intense, and the wind was blowing, just howling in there. As I stood up, it ripped my shelter right off of me. So I said, well, I guess I'm up. I had no choice in that. And it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. I got a lot of smoke, but I had a little bit of air. We secured our shelters with some tools and shovels. And now we turned around, and probably the most horrible sight I've ever seen. Tents were scattered around, very dark, smoky, wind blowing probably 67 miles an hour, and yellow things burning. And that's all we could see. It looked like people laying around burning. I figured that people had got up and ran and been burned down. And I almost got sick. I mean, physically it upset me. And at that time, I walked over behind me, and one of them was a yellow pack. It was our line gear. It was burning, and I threw it out of the way, and it had fuel bottles attached to it. And then I could see that these were pieces of people's gear that was burning, and that the tents looked pretty good. The wind was just strong. So we went around and we started talking, who are you? We got a name out of somebody, and I said, you're all right, stand up. And we got everybody up on their feet. And at that time, we realized we started working on the injured people and tried to get some organization back going. We tried to get things to come around pretty quick. Okay. And like we were talking, we were up and checking people. There's a few things that kind of glossed over that we should probably bring in here. I was not initially with the crew when they started pulling shelters. And there was a kind of a reluctance to do that. Rick started that. And thank God he did, because that extra minute or two before I got there, the meadow's probably 100, 125 yards long, possibly longer. It seemed like it was about 10 miles when I was running across. Again, I was in the timber when it blew. I went up about 50 yards till I hit the meadow, and then across the timber. I could see the guys preparing their area, and some of the people with shelters already out. At that point, we discovered the road and moved the people to the road. When the people finally realized that this wasn't preparation or, well, maybe it's going to happen, this is no kidding around, here we go. Got quiet. People started moving like professionals. There was orders were given, and people followed instantly. There was no panic. I don't know whether that's the training or the quality of the people we had, or Rick's leadership in this situation. When I got into the scene of the actual deployment, the sawyers who did not have tools, that's what we were talking about, I think, when we quit. We were a little short on tools. Were taking people's line gear and removing the fuel bottles and throwing them as far as they could. I couldn't believe it. The people helping each other, and it was camaraderie, but it was esprit de corps also. There was some tough people working there, because at this time the sawyers had not pulled their shelter. They were dumping fuel and they were throwing fusees. Also, there are more experienced firefighters. They were lighting fires around us to try to clear a little bit of black line.
So you were trying to do it,
turn
yourself along.
Yeah,
You had time to do something.
Yeah, we got the fusees lit and we pitched them and hoped that they would build away from us. I mean, this was desperation move. At this point, everybody realized that there's no chance for survival except in a tent. And so all our efforts turned on preparing ourselves for the getting burned over and increasing our chances with everything possible. We did have kind of a plan. We got everybody on the road. Of course, the road being fairly narrow, you can get 2 or 3 tents across it. So we were in kind of a line. I don't know whether by choice or by example. Everybody was lined up behind Rick. He was pointed right down the road, right towards the head of where the fire came from.
Towards the fire.
Right, dead on towards the fire. And I got up there, and because Todd, the fellow that I helped with his shelter, was behind Rick, I ended up to the side. I was off the road a little bit. So in essence, we had Rick in the front and myself at an angle to him, facing the head of the fire. And everybody flared out behind us. Again, I don't know whether that was chance or whatever. We still feel, we talked about it a lot now, maybe in different circumstances it's not important. We feel that keeping the tents together in this situation protected the people behind and in the middle of us. We had a damaged shelter behind us. That was another thing that was involved in before I tinned up. One of my sawyers opened his shelter, and there was about a 30-inch ripping, just open. And he looked at me like, I guess I'm done. And I entertained the idea of giving him my shelter and us doubling up. And then I said, Bill, remember the film. Grab the tent, close it up, and pull it under you. He's a small bodied person. And he's got a good head on his shoulders, and I just hoped that he would do it right and get it underneath him. He had room in there, and he survived excellent. He had no injuries whatsoever. So at least that part of our training came in handy there.
What kind of training did you have altogether as far as your crew knowing how to use the shelters and those things? What have you gone through?
Okay, we watched the standard Forest Service film, what is it called, Your Last Resort or something like that. It's a little bit outdated, I feel. stresses the last resort too much. The fire shelters don't cost that much. I'd almost rather see them deployed more. I don't want people to rely on them to go into a hole and say, that's all right, I can go in there because I got a shelter. But there shouldn't be that stigma attached to deploying your shelter. And there is, especially with hot shot crews. Most of the deployments have not been with Category 1 crews.
Using your shelter is a bad thing. That's what you're
Not
saying.
necessarily a bad thing, but shots are supposed to be tough. You should turn around and sprint it out ahead of the fire or something. In the back of my mind, and maybe I'm old school, the shelter was, just before you went down and you crawl inside of it, maybe. It just wasn't something to be used all the time. And I don't like that. But anyway, we watched that film, and then we watched the Butte fire shelter deployment video, which I thought was real good. People got an idea what was coming. They learned about the wind. I remember that. So when the wind came, I was not all that surprised, and I was ready to hold my tent down. The noise is pretty scary. The heat, of course, that comes from that training film and the guys in there talking on the radio. And then we do something. We take all our fire shelters from the previous year and hand them out to everybody. And they actually open them up, unroll them, crawl inside of them, use the straps, and get down on the ground and see what it's like inside of them. And how they're going to have to pull the sides in, and how they're going to have to hook their arms in the front, and how they're going to have to hook their feet in the straps in the back. So in that aspect, we were ready for that. And I think our deployment was pretty good, as evidenced by the lack of injuries that we had. For what I feel was a real severe fire.
Any suggestions on things that we can incorporate?
I'd like to see everybody get in one, of course, whether or not you put some heat and smoke in there or not. I don't know whether it's feasible for liability, but I would like to see you get in there and take a little heat, take a little smoke. Whether you could prepare a training area, build out some dirt, set up some shelters, throw a little straw or white grass around. You don't have to cook somebody, but let them see that if they touch the shelter, it's hot. And if you stay in the middle and you keep your face down, that you're all right. Let them see that little ring of light that goes around the bottom of your shelter. It's horrifying, but it's good. Let them see what's going to happen. Let them get a feel for it. Maybe take the fire away and give them some wind or something so that they know how to handle that shelter. So they're confident in it. And then you just have to rely on the equipment and hope it works.
Did you describe the fire as it came towards you then once you did get some people in the shoulder?
Okay. We had Rick was in his shelter, and his deployment looked good. It looked just like in the training field. I turned around, people were working on their shelter. This time we knew there was no chance of survival unless you're in it. I worked with Todd, and I looked up. The timber on the edge of the meadow exploded in the flame, and a ton of flame came from the trees towards us. At this point, Todd went down on the ground in his shelter. I pulled mine out, I ripped my cover, and shook it out, got it over my shoulders, and hit the ground just as that fire hit us. It passed over. I tried to get situated again. I actually got up on my knees, and I looked out as I was ready to drop spread my front of my shelter out, and I looked, and about 50 feet away from us were balls of what I imagine were unburned gases. They were dark maroon, purplish color, rolling at us like this. They're about 2 feet off the ground. That was a scary sight. There was white, it looked like steam around the front of it being pushed aside. And then the flame coming. And I hit the ground, and that really nailed it. It really hit us pretty hard. We took a lot of heat on that. I believe that fire hit our tents. The guys said they saw orange through the pinholes in the seam. And it actually felt like somebody just pushed your tent. At that time, we had some screaming, some movement. found out later that nobody had actually got up and moved, but the tents were blown back into your face or up against the side of your body. Depends on which way you were oriented. And that's when you knew you had to rely on your equipment. At that point, near as I can remember, we took the smoke first. I had fire come under mine, so I don't know how much smoke other people took. Because when I put it out, I had a lot of steam in the tent also. The heat increased, and smoke increased to where you just thought you couldn't get another breath. At that point, something else hit us, and the smoke cleared out of my tent instantly. I actually felt cold air come in my tent. I don't know whether it came out of the ground. I think what happened was the fire went actually over us. It was behind us at this point, or that initial blast, and it pulled air behind it. Rick's and my tent both cleared almost just like clean air. And then, you felt pretty good. Then the grass fire came around us, and we took a little smoke on that. That was the worst of it. I think all the time that I was in the tent, from the time I hit the ground to the first time I poked my head out and looked at Rick, no more than 3 minutes for me. Maybe 7 or 8, maybe 10 at the most for Rick, who was the first one in the shelter. He said about 10. So we agree on a time frame in there. And it didn't seem that long to me, really. Some people said it seemed like forever, but
3 to 10 minutes or kind of thing.
I'm sure I was in there no more than 3 or 4 minutes. 3 minutes is what I'm estimating because, like I said, I was in late and I got up early.
How about wind?
Wind? Real strong. Came from the way the head was coming and hit us. It passed, though. It passed real quick. The head of that was super violent. Terrible violent. I think if you weren't holding your shelter, you'd lose it. I think if you were standing up, it'd knock you down. But it passed, and there was no duration to the wind. My tent kind of straightened back up. I poked around a little bit. It was hot. I didn't, of course, like I said, I didn't have my sleeves down and my gloves on, and it was touching my hand. It was hot, so I poked it out, and it stayed. I had no more problem holding my tent down. You could hear that there was fire everywhere around it, but there was no violent wind at that time. We got hit with a ball of gas and fire that would have, I'm sure, killed everybody if you didn't have your tents on. And I believe after that you could have survived without a tent. I think if you'd have been in a tent for 30 seconds, you'd have survived. So
if you were avoiding that inhalation of that super heat gas and sucking it in.
And as we get up to the meadow, you'll be able to see we were probably 75 to 100 yards rolling up in the top third from the timber that got us. There were spot fires behind us, but they weren't going to get us. It came 75 yards away from that timber with that intensity. If we'd have been in the timber, I don't think we'd have made it.
You wouldn't have made it in the timber?
What we'd have done was gone in that draw, down in the bottom. It was kind of greener than it was up on the side, and there was less pine needles in it. Well, we sat there after we were administering first aid and all. There was still pretty hot fire around us for 30 to 40 minutes. I think there had been more serious injuries. We'd taken more heat. I don't know what the smoke was like in there. And I don't want to stay in them any longer than I have to. Like I said, I'm sure I pulled up early the first time. And if I'd have been able to stay up, I'd have stayed up then. But I wanted out of there pretty quick. Other people were locked into their tents. People were reluctant to get out. And maybe they got comfortable. They felt, I made it because they heard us walking around there. So, the only